of. The preacher's words blurred into the smell of wood smoke and wet wool. Madeline Farrow kept her eyes on the cracked linoleum floor of the Cassidy Creek municipal office, counting the brown water stains as if they were the last solid things in the world. She had sold the pearl earrings her mother left her 3 days ago to pay the filing fee. Now she was signing her name beside a man she had spoken to exactly twice. His name was Bertram Holst. He was 41 to her 24. He had come into the hardware store where she'd been clerking for 6 weeks, the only job Cassidy Creek had offered a woman with a commerce diploma and no references, and bought $300 worth of fencing wire without blinking. He had asked the store owner, not her, whether there was a woman in town who needed a way out. She had heard it from the back room while she was counting bolts into a paper bag. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't anything. It was the particular arithmetic of a woman with $47 and a landlord who'd been knocking on her door since Tuesday. The justice of the peace stamped the paper. That was that. Bertram's truck was a dented F-250 with a cracked passenger mirror and a bench seat patched with electrical tape. He loaded her one bag into the truck bed without asking if she wanted help and climbed in. She got in on her own side. He smelled of chain oil, pine resin, and something faintly metallic she couldn't name. He hadn't shaved in what looked like 2 weeks. His hands on the steering wheel were large and weathered, the knuckles of his right hand carrying an old scar she didn't ask about. They drove north out of town without a word. The last houses of Cassidy Creek disappeared in the side mirror. The highway gave way to a 2-lane road, then to gravel, then to a rutted track barely wide enough for the truck. The boreal forest closed in on both sides, black spruce and white birch pressing close, their branches dragging against the truck roof as they climbed. "How far?" Madeline asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "A ways." He didn't look at her. She turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was the flat gray of old pewter. October in northern Ontario meant darkness by 5. It meant temperatures that didn't apologize. She was wearing a cotton cardigan over a second-hand blouse. She had one winter coat, a thin quilted thing from the discount bin at the church sale, folded on the seat between them. After an hour, he reached behind the seat without breaking his eyes from the road and dropped a canvas barn jacket in her lap. It was enormous, stiff with cold, and smelled aggressively of diesel. She put it on. It fell past her hips. She didn't thank him. He didn't seem to expect it. The track got worse. The gravel disappeared entirely. The truck lurched and bucked over frost-heaved ground, headlights throwing long yellow tunnels into the trees ahead. Madeline gripped the door handle and stared straight through the windshield. She had been hungry since morning. She'd spent her last cash on a coffee, which she'd drunk too fast, and her stomach was now a tight, hollow knot behind her ribs. She did not ask when they would eat. She would not ask him for anything she didn't have to. They crossed a creek on a plank bridge that flexed under the truck's weight. The planks were old and dark with wet, but they held. The truck climbed the far bank into a thick stand of spruce, and then the track deteriorated into 2 wheel ruts through dead grass frozen hard. The truck's front tire hit a buried rock. The whole chassis jolted. Madeline's head cracked against the window frame. "You all right?" he asked, the first full sentence since they left. "Fine." She pressed her palm against the window glass, which was cold enough to sting. "Almost." She didn't know if he meant almost all right or almost there. She didn't ask. Then the trees broke. Above, the track opened onto a wide, sloping clearing, maybe 2 acres, sheltered on 3 sides by a ridge of rock that rose out of the forest like the back of something sleeping. The sky above the clearing was enormous after the closeness of the trees. Above, and at the back of the clearing, where the ridge curved down to meet the flat ground, sat a structure that made no sense. Madeline leaned forward in her seat. It was built of timber and stone, but not the rough-hewn, barely upright type of structure she had been bracing herself for since they left pavement. It was 3 stories. The logs were massive, hand-fitted, dovetailed at the corners with the kind of joinery she'd seen in coffee table books about heritage craft. A wide, covered porch ran the full length of the ground floor, and through the darkness she could make out windows. Actual divided light windows, not cheap vinyl rectangles. Warm gold light pressing through the glass and spilling across the snow that had begun to settle on the porch boards. Above, two copper lanterns flanked the front door, lit, casting overlapping circles of amber light against the dark stone foundation. There was a timber frame workshop to the left, large, clearly well used, and beside it a woodshed stacked floor to ceiling with split birch, enough wood for a decade if you were careful. A generator shed sat a little further out, painted dark green to disappear into the tree line, its exhaust pipe ticking with warmth. Madeline realized her hand was pressed flat against the cold glass of the truck window. "Whose is this?" she said. Her voice came out wrong, too small for the question. "Ours." He said it the way you'd say the sky was gray, like it required no discussion. She turned to look at him. He was already cutting the engine. The anger came up so fast it bypassed every polite thing she'd ever been taught. The whole drive, frozen to the bone in a truck from the 80s, the cracked mirror, the patched seat, the barn jacket thrown at her like a blanket over a horse. He had sat 3 feet from her and let her believe she was going to spend her marriage in a shack without plumbing. She shoved the truck door open and got out, boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cold hit her like a wall. She didn't care. "You let me think," she started. "Come inside." He was already walking toward the porch. She caught up to him in 3 long strides and stepped in front of him. He stopped. She was a foot shorter than him and had to tilt her head back to look at him properly, which made her angrier. "You sat in that truck for 3 hours, she said, her voice shaking now, not from cold, "and let me sit there thinking I was being taken to God knows what. I had $47, Bertram. I had 1 bag of, I thought. I know what you thought." He looked at her. His eyes, which she'd barely had a chance to see in the low light of the municipal office, were a particular shade of gray-green, the color of lake water in October. They weren't unkind. They weren't anything she had a word for. "Come inside. You can be angry inside. I'm angry outside." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. He reached past her and pushed the front door open. Heat came out in a wave, the smell of wood fire and something cooking, onions and broth, heavy and warm, and her body betrayed her completely. Her knees going soft with longing before her pride had a chance to object. She walked inside. The front hall was wide, floored in wide plank Douglas fir. The wood warm gold in the lamplight. A coat rack made of antler tines stood against the wall, hung with work coats and a single older fleece. The ceiling was high, the underside of the second floor exposed, the beams as thick as her torso. A staircase of the same timber rose along the right wall, and at the far end of the hall, an open archway led toward the light and the food. She stood there in Bertram's enormous barn jacket, her 1 bag at her feet, and did not know what to do with herself. He came in behind her and closed the door, throwing a heavy iron bolt. He pulled off his work coat and hung it without ceremony. She noticed in the cleaner light of the hall that the flannel shirt underneath it was washed soft and fitted properly across the shoulders. His boots were quality, she realized. Old, extremely worn, but originally expensive. She hadn't registered it at the time of the ceremony. She'd been looking at the floor. "Bathrooms at the top of the stairs," he said. "Water's good, pressure's fine, tank's full. Come down when you're ready." He walked toward the kitchen without looking back. She stood there another moment. Then she picked up her bag and climbed the stairs. The bathroom was larger than her first apartment. The fixtures were older, but everything was clean. The grout scrubbed pale, the towels hanging in a precise row, none of it decorative. A square of soap sat on the edge of the sink, unscented. A clean towel had been laid across the closed toilet lid, put there before she arrived. She sat on the edge of the tub and pressed the heels of her hands against her closed eyes. She had walked into this with nothing and no alternatives. She had told herself it didn't matter what the situation was, as long as she could think clearly and survive it. She had made a list on the back of an envelope before she signed. The risks, the possible exits, the worst-case scenarios. She had been prepared for a man with nothing trying to acquire a woman to do his housework. She had been prepared to be cold and useful and eventually figure out a different future. She had not been prepared for this. She washed her face. The water was hot and came out instantly. No waiting. A detail her cold bones appreciated without being asked. She dried off with the clean towel, hung it back neatly, and went downstairs. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it took her a moment in the doorway to catalog it all. A long harvest table of rough-sawn maple, scarred with use. A cast-iron wood stove against the interior wall, radiating enormous heat. A propane range beside it, modern and professional grade. Open shelving along the east wall, crowded with preserving jars. She counted several dozen. Tomatoes, beans, beets, things in amber brine she couldn't identify. Bundles of dried herbs hung from an overhead rack. A root vegetable smell undercut everything, the good particular smell of a larder that's actually used. Bertram was standing at the propane range. He'd lit the overhead lamp, a hand-forged iron fixture with 6 candle bulbs, and in its light he looked less like the man from the municipal office, and more like someone who had been doing this specific thing in this specific kitchen for a very long time. He ladled soup into 2 bowls, set a plate of bread beside them, thick-sliced and clearly made here not bought, and brought both bowls to the table. He set one at the near end and one across from it, then went back for the bread. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat. She picked up the spoon and made herself eat slowly, made herself chew. The soup was a beef and root vegetable thing, not elaborate, nothing fancy in it. But it was real food, cooked by someone who knew how to cook and had good ingredients. Her stomach unclenched by degrees. She ate the whole bowl and most of the bread. He ate in silence. So did she. The wood stove clicked. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the spruce. When she was done, she set the spoon in the bowl and looked at him. "Tell me," she said, "why you live like that in town? That truck, those clothes." He took a long time before answering. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, looking at the table. "My father built this place," he said. "Spent 20 years doing it, log by log, every spare hour he had. When he died, he left it to me. Left me the land, the timber rights, the whole thing." He turned the mug slowly. "My wife came up here once. She lasted a week. Said it was too far from everything, too cold, too nothing. She was right about all of those things. She wasn't wrong." He stopped. "When she left, she took what she could carry. And she talked. Told enough people that I had money in the property that for 2 years after, every person I met, I could see them doing the math." Madeline said nothing. She understood the shape of what he was describing without needing the whole of it. "So you dress like you have nothing," she said. "I live like I live." He looked at her. "I don't dress up for town. You could have told me. I could have." He didn't argue the point. "I wanted to see what you'd make of it. Whether you'd sit in that truck for 3 hours and not ask me for anything. And if I had asked," he considered this, "I'd have answered." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. In the amber light of the kitchen, with the wood stove popping quietly, and the smell of the soup still warm in the air, she tried to take an honest account of the man across from her. He was not handsome in any conventional way. His face had the kind of weathering that happens when a person spends most of their life outside. The deep lines around his eyes, the roughness of the jaw. His hands, which she'd kept looking at without meaning to, were the most telling thing about him. The scarring and the thickness of the knuckles, the particular calluses that come from actual work, sustained over years. They were the hands of someone who built things and fixed things and did not stop when it hurt. She had grown up watching her father's hands do nothing but shuffle papers and open bottles. She had more data than she wanted on what the other kind of man looked like. She didn't say any of that. She pushed back her chair and carried both bowls to the sink. "Do you have spare blankets?" she said, running the water. "Close it at the top of the stairs." He rose and brought his mug over. "You don't have to do the dishes, I know." She did them anyway. He didn't argue. He dried, setting things back in their places with the exactness of someone who lived alone for a long time and kept order by habit. They stood at the sink in the big warm kitchen, not speaking. And the silence was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 people sizing each other up honestly, without pretending otherwise. She went to bed early. In a room on the 2nd floor that held a proper bed with a quilted cover and a small wood stove that Bertram had lit before she came up, she realized, because the cast iron was already warm. There was a reading lamp. There was a window overlooking the clearing, and through the glass she could see the outline of the ridge against a sky that had cleared. The stars of northern Ontario, doing what they always did up here, spreading out with a kind of arrogance that you only got far enough from anything to deserve. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the $47. She thought about the earrings. She thought about the way her hand had pressed flat against the truck window when she first saw the light in those divided light windows. She thought about the clean towel on the toilet lid, put there before she arrived. The only piece of this whole thing he had bothered to make easier for her, quietly, without telling her he'd done it. She slept. The first weeks had the careful, provisional quality of a truce neither party had formally signed. Madeline woke before him, which surprised her. She came down to a cold kitchen, the wood stove banked low, and built the fire up herself. She'd watched him do it the first morning, and she was not going to ask to be shown twice. By the time the coffee was ready, she'd also figured out the propane range, which had an igniter that stuck, and had a pot of oatmeal going from the canister on the shelf. He came in from outside already, boots wet, face cold, carrying an armful of wood that he stacked by the stove without commenting on the breakfast. He poured his own coffee and sat. She sat across from him with her bowl. "You were up early," he said. "So were you." He looked at her. "Generator needed checking. We got a cold snap last night." "I know. I heard it in the walls." She had lain awake for an hour listening to the house settle and shift in the cold, and had found it strangely more comforting than the silence of the shared apartment she'd had in Toronto before everything fell apart. That silence had been the silence of two people pretending not to know what was happening. This cold, specific working silence was something else entirely. He worked the timber stands on the East Ridge 3 days a week, selective harvest, his own operation, which explained the chainsaw smell that arrived with him in the evenings. She explored the house on the days he was gone, room by room, not snooping but cataloging, which was a distinction that mattered to her. There were 6 rooms on the upper floors and 3 below. One upper room held a wall of bookshelves, floor to ceiling, and she spent a morning going through them slowly, finding water-stained paperbacks of Farley Mowat, a complete set of Pierre Bertram in hardcover, a clutch of old forestry manuals, and unexpectedly a good half-shelf of philosophy, Camus, Wittgenstein, a worn Penguin edition of Marcus Aurelius with underlined passages throughout. She stood holding the Marcus Aurelius for a long moment. She had pictured the inside of his mind as something like the inside of the truck, functional, utilitarian, repaired with whatever was at hand. The underlined passages made her revise the picture somewhat. She put it back carefully and went down to start dinner. At the end of the second week, she found the woodshed doors off their hinges, one having pulled the screws out of the frame in the last windstorm. She spent an afternoon with the tools from the workshop. She'd grown up helping her uncle on his properties. She knew which end of a drill was which, resetting the screws with longer ones from the jar on the workshop shelf, shimming the hinge plate, rehinging the door, checking the sweep on both. Bertram found her finishing up at dusk. He stood in the workshop doorway, work coat open, and looked at the door she was swinging on its rehung hinge. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Those doors have been like that since August, I noticed." She set the drill back in its bracket. He nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone humoring a small accomplishment, the nod of someone recalibrating. She walked past him into the workshop to hang up the tool belt, and he moved aside to let her. And the particular geometry of that small moment, him stepping aside, her walking through, neither of them making a thing of it, settled something in the house that had been slightly out of balance. There was a night in the 3rd week when a storm came in hard from the northwest, and the generator shed door didn't latch properly, and she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of it banging. She lay still in the dark for a moment, then got up, put on her wool sweater and her boots, went downstairs and out into the storm. The wind was genuine, not polite Ontario weather, but something with weight and intention to it, and the cold went through her sweater instantly. She crossed the clearing with her head down and got the shed door latched with the barrel bolt, which had vibrated itself sideways. It took 2 tries with numb fingers. She got it. She turned to go back, and Bertram was standing on the porch with a lantern, watching. He didn't say anything when she came back in, snow on her shoulders, face stiff with cold. He handed her a heavy wool blanket from the hook behind the door and went to put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in the blanket while he made tea, and they sat opposite each other at 1 in the morning with the storm beating against the north windows and said nothing at all. And it was not awkward. She didn't know exactly what it was, but it was not that. One evening in the 4th week he came in from the ridge at dusk and set something on the kitchen table before he went to wash up. It was a book, the same Penguin Aurelius from the library upstairs, which she had clearly left a centimeter off its original position on the shelf. She looked at it. She looked at him. "There's an edition with better notes," he said. "I'll order it next time I'm in town. You don't need to do that." "I know," he said, and went to wash his hands. The evening he gave her the keys. The birch trees at the edge of the clearing were just beginning to show the first green of May, pale and hesitant, the color of something deciding whether to commit. The snow was still in the north-facing shadows of the ridge, but the ground in the clearing was bare, and the smell of thaw was everywhere, that specific northern smell of cold earth coming back into itself. He set 2 keys on the table during supper. An iron key for the gate. There was a gate at the trackhead she hadn't known was locked. She'd always come and gone with him, and a smaller brass one. "Front gate in the workshop," he said. "The truck keys on the hook by the door. You know where town is." He pushed the keys toward her side of the table. "Road'll be passable in a week. 2 at the most." She looked at the keys. She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything else about it," she said. "Nothing to say." He took a drink of his water. "You know what I've got here, You can make your own accounting." What he had was approximately 300 acres of productive timber, a house worth considerably more than anything she'd have guessed from the outside, a workshop full of equipment, and whatever was in the savings accounts she didn't know the numbers on and hadn't asked about. He'd told her about the timber rights and the log sales without prompting. One evening, when she'd asked about the East Ridge operations, and she'd done the rough math in her head and not let her face do anything with it, she picked up one of the keys, turned it in her fingers. The first night, the truck with the patched seat, the barn jacket dropped in her lap. The hard tack he'd certainly not needed to give her. She understood now that he'd eaten it himself by choice on every previous trip, that there was an entire cooler behind the seat she'd have found if she'd looked, full of proper food he hadn't offered. That part still sat in her chest like a splinter. She had not decided yet what to do with it, but she also thought about the towel on the toilet lid put there before she arrived. The wood stove lit in her room, warming before she came up. The way he'd stepped aside in the workshop doorway. The Aurelius. "I want to know something," she said. He waited. "That first morning, when you said you'd have answered if I'd asked." She set the key down. "What would you have said?" He looked at the table for a moment, then at her, that it was far and it was cold, and you weren't going to like the first part of it. He turned his mug a half rotation. "And that I'd make sure you were all right." "Make sure, yes, even if I turned out to be your worst possible scenario." "I had contingencies," he said. It was so dry it took her a moment, and then something in her chest did a thing she wasn't entirely prepared for, which was the first genuinely involuntary laugh she'd had in a very long time. It came out before she could stop it, quiet but real, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. He didn't laugh, but the lines around his eyes shifted in a way she had learned, over 5 weeks, to read. She looked at the keys on the table. She thought about what she'd said to herself on the drive up, in the dark cab of the truck with the cold coming through the floor and the patched seat rough beneath her, that she would be clear-eyed about this, that she would not be a fool, that she would survive the first part, and then she would figure out the next part. She had survived the first part. The next part was sitting across the table from her, holding a mug with both scarred hands, waiting without any apparent anxiety for her to do whatever she was going to do. She picked up the key, the iron one, the heavy one, the gate key. She held it a moment. "I'm going to need better boots before the next winter," she said. "The ones I have won't hold up." He said nothing for a moment. "Lacrosse makes a good pack boot. I'll add it to the order, and I want to learn the generator properly. All of it. Not just the basics. That's reasonable. And I'm going to keep fixing things." She looked at him. "If something needs fixing, I'm going to fix it. I'm not asking." "I noticed you don't," he said. She set the iron key back on the table, not far from her, entirely within reach, but down, above. The birch on the south end of the clearing, she said, picking up her fork again. Two of them should come down before they get any bigger. They're too close to the porch roof. He turned and looked toward the south window, though it was full dark outside and he obviously couldn't see them. She had the impression he was looking at them anyway, from memory. "I'll get the chainsaw out tomorrow," he said. Outside, the first real night of May was coming down over the ridge, and through the kitchen window the stars were beginning, one at a time, to commit.